live.
Live.
Hey, here we are. Hi, everyone. I am with Caroline Topperman, the intrepid Caroline Topperman, my sometimes collaborator, great friend, and former mentee. Can't call her a mentee anymore because now we're sort of both in the literary trenches together. So, been doing that for a while. And we're going to talk about what it means that this is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I don't know what people are doing today to remember. I know that the theme for this year is bridging the generations. So this seems kind of like a perfect time to talk to you and find out why it's meaningful to you. It's meaningful to me, but I'll hold my comments for a minute. So just tell us a bit about, we're just going to do a little 15 minutes here so you can kind of dip in and dip out and go off and do your own thing. But yeah, Caroline, why do you care about today? What's your connection to all of this? Why does it
Mm,
matter?
Thank you for doing this with me today. It's actually great. Um, my connection is that three-quarters of my mother's family were murdered during the Holocaust and didn't make it out. So, uh, I grew up with all the holes, not knowing any of that. And like not knowing really their history or what happened. I'm still searching for it. And my grandparents survived the Holocaust. They were among the several 100,000 Jews that made it to Uzbekistan. Um, but their journey there, was very difficult too. Um, and so it's personal. It's
It's,
very personal.
yeah.
Yeah.
And your background this is connected to the Polish Jews. Do you want to talk a bit about what was Polish Jews were facing during that time?
Yeah. And, so Poland was a little bit different at the time because my grandparents were from Lvov, which is now Lviv, Ukraine. So all the borders were different. Um, Poland was, when it was taken over, that's where a lot of the concentration camps were set up. So luckily, my grandparents were on the eastern side of the country, and they weren't taken right away. They managed because Russia was or Soviet Russia was they had the stronghold. So, it was a little bit different for them than some people who were like either in Krakow or Warsaw or somewhere on the western side where the Germans had come in. So my grandparents luckily were able to flee, but their parents didn't make it out. My grandfather's sister survived in Lviv in a 2 meter by 2 meter attic with another person. Um, and so their story, of course, was a bit different because but a lot of their friends were in the camps.
Mhm.
Um, and most of them obviously didn't make it out. Some did. And then a lot of their friends growing up, I knew other individuals who had survived in the forests. I know one gentleman, now long deceased, but he had 3 times during the war he stood in front of a pit of bodies with a Nazi gun to his head, and 3 times he managed to make it out.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so it was Poland at the time it wasn't Poland. It was under occupied Germany, and I think that that's one thing people forget often. Because when I moved to Poland, and a lot of people are not happy with me that I did that I have a Polish passport, but it wasn't Poland at the time.
Why? So the little detour there. Why were people be unhappy that you moved to Poland? Like, why would that
Weird.
even be an issue?
I hear
What
it a
were you
lot
doing
from
there? What were you doing there? And
I know. I moved there a bit on a whim because I thought it would be interesting to move there and try, to see. Um, I needed a break from Vancouver where I was living. But I think a lot of Jewish people have accused me of moving to this horrible place, which I think in their minds is just eternally gray, and I don't know, looks like it came out of a World War II movie, which is not the case.
Mm.
But yeah, I think that I don't see that version of Poland. A lot of countries were complicit during the war.
Yeah.
A lot of countries, I think, are still complicit. Poland, I think, has a lot of issues and a lot of things it needs to look at. But at the same time, it wasn't Poland. It was under occupied Nazi Germany.
Right.
The
Right.
government had fled within the first couple of weeks of the war. So
Yeah.
it wasn't Poland. I just think that's important to say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and part of the bond between the two of us is like this passion for trying to recover history, especially through families, like families and the roots as a pipeline to history and to the complicating the narratives, right, that kind of live on and the stereotypes that live on. And what you did with your Roots Cast a Shadow, your first book, was really to do a deep dive, to make the counterintuitive move of going from Vancouver to Warsaw. Um, but for a reason, right? And realizing that, okay, this is really, oh, here's a place where I have really incredible family stories. And then you became the person who did that research and the chronicler, and you haven't stopped since. Okay, so I have one quick question, then I'll say something. So when do you remember as a child when you first learned about how you first learned about the Holocaust? Because in your family, so it's part of the family stories, what would you say was your first experience of realizing, or maybe the most powerful, like really that
Yeah.
drove it home?
I don't remember exactly when I first learned about it. I think it was always just this thing that sort of simmered in the family. But the first time that like I really remember this happening, like really doing it, somewhere between 10 and 13, and I had started reading these books, The Silver Sword, Sally J. Friedman as herself. There were a few other books like that. My mother had given me Davita's Harp. And I started asking questions about it, and I started reading about World War II in general, and then usually it was Jewish, from a Jewish perspective, often from a Polish perspective. And I remember that my grandmother was furious when I started asking questions. And she basically forbade my mother to talk about it. Obviously, my mother did not listen, but she didn't want my sister or me to have anything to do with this at all. She didn't want us to know anything about it. It was just too much, I think, for her. She never talked about it really. It was only after years later in 2015, I think, that my uncle convinced her to do an interview where she finally talked about it a little bit. But growing up,
That's very interesting.
yeah,
So she was of the generation, she had lived experience, but
yeah,
her response was the silence, right? The protect, like the armature of silence.
yeah,
That's what she wanted, and said that she was furious with your mother
yeah,
because your mother's orientation was completely different, right?
yeah,
Put
yeah,
books in the girls' hands, talk to the girls, talk to you and your sister, make sure you were armed with knowledge and understanding.
exactly.
So interesting in a family. So it's interesting. So I am not Jewish. I don't have any Jewish history that I know of or anything in my family. Classic European mix, mongrelly mutt, English, Irish, and German. So that goes back, but the German part of the family completely evaporated. The records of contact with them evaporated by World War One, because by that point, World War One, right? It's the English and the Canadians fighting the Germans. So we've lost all of that history. Although I visited the village where they were from, and there were concentration camps in that zone. They were, so these are things that you have to reckon with in your family history. But ironically, the first I tripped over anything about this was I would have been about 8 or so, and this is the 1960s, and lived in the city of Hamilton. And one of the girls I played with, her mother was from Austria, and her mother had a tattoo on her arm. And I was, of course, very curious, like, what's with the tattoo? And this friend, so this is, Gudrun, my playmate at 8 years old, told me all about Hitler. This is like while we're playing Barbies, you know.
Yeah.
So Barbies and Hitler and their mom with the tattoo. I mean, it was a bit much, you know. Although I think she also introduced me to the facts of life, so it kind of would have flowed, you know. These life and death things come together. But that was it, you know. It was sort of my tripping over people having these experiences, and my mother having to explain to me, well, this is what this meant. Um, but really, it was like literally, it would have been 40 years ago this time in my life when I was a young grad student that I interviewed Holocaust survivors. And that was my first experience of hearing first person accounts and very different six different people, and from very different part, you know, sophisticated German Jew, right, who had come from a very assimilated family. The family didn't believe anything would ever happen to them. Jews from Hungary, you know, who had been in the camps and survived, like all these different stories. And I think what I had wasn't prepared for, me and my hapless doing field work as a, you know, an anthropology course, going in with like my pen and paper, because we didn't even have tape recorder. I even didn't have a tape recorder. I had no idea what it would mean for people to tell their stories. Like these were six individuals who would go out in the community and talk to school groups, but it was very different them sitting down with me one on one in their home and opening up. Like one woman brought out her Star of David and showed me her Star of David, and you know that changed my life. That experience changed my life. It changed my orientation to what I would study, to how I would, the kind of philosophy I would carry through life about people's stories and storytelling, and the power of witness, like the power of their taking trauma in their lives and then becoming witnesses to that and being willing to share that with other people, not to traumatize me, the hapless grad student, but to teach me
Yeah.
what had happened. And that changed everything for me. I mean, 40 years later, I'm still living out of the orientation that I experienced from that time.
I think that for a lot of people too, like for my grandfather, because he didn't talk about it either, but he wrote that book that's sitting at in Stanford at the Hoover Institute,
Yeah.
and I think it was just easier to write for him, for example, than to speak it. I think it was just, you know, like it was just easier for him to sit down and write it the way he knew how to write it, the way he wanted to do it, the way he wanted to say it,
Mm,
than to speak it. So I,
interesting.
yeah, and I think that that's part of that. That was the legacy that he was able to leave.
So his was, how would you describe that? That was more like more chronicling, right?
Yeah, it was a chronicle, and it's not very I mean, I feel bad saying it. It's not very interesting in terms of, there are just pages of people that he knew, that he talks about people who I don't know who these people were, and he talks a lot about his engineering, which was his passion.
Mhm.
But there were things in there that, you know, reading between the lines, or now and then he'd open up a little bit and put a little bit of himself in there, and a
Yeah.
little bit of what he did. And I think so, in a way, even though he never talked about it, that was the legacy he was able to leave for, you know,
Mm.
his grandchildren, and then even great grandchildren now.
Mhm. That's so interesting, isn't it? So silence, like your grandmother saying, silence, like just seal it. Just seal the record so that that's it. Your mother with education, right? And I want you to talk a bit about what your mother did too, right?
Yeah.
So what she did. And then your grandfather leaving a chronicle. So there's documentation, right? And then there's sort of the museum orientation, which is to work with cultural material, like material culture, right? Anything they can find that's concrete evidence in addition to people's stories. So all these orientate, and then I guess my orientation, which is just like a kind of the sacred trust of bearing witness to other people's stories, you know, like
Yeah.
that is a really powerful, important thing to do, whether you have any direct relationship or not. If these are if these are things that people carry in them, we have a responsibility to listen and remember, like to commemorate as we're doing today, right? 81, this is the 81st
I know.
anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz. Like this matters at this time more than ever.
Yeah, and I think that's why that was I think my mother reminds me of you in that way, or she did, because because she, as you know, she found out that she was a Jew on the schoolyard. She,
Yeah.
in the school. on a
In the
schoolyard.
schoolyard.
In a
Yes.
schoolyard. Sorry. This is my Polish brain. And she basically, so she didn't know. They didn't grow up that way, even though uh, my grandparents just wanted to hide it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. In one of her interviews, my grandmother said they all knew. Everybody knew what had happened. Everybody knew, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to deal. It was just too much. And so I think in a way, because of that, my grandmother, her life's mission, my mother's life's mission almost was to do what kind of what you did, is to get these stories, bring these stories out, talk about these stories. I'm now finding all these. She wrote for the CBC articles for, or she did voice even for the CBC radio for different. Uh, I guess for the Polish diaspora, but some of it actually was aired in Poland, I think, too. And she,
Mm.
every time she saw anti-Semitism, she fought anti-Semitism all the time. I have all those letters to the editor where she was trying to make sense of it, and make sense of it versus blaming every single Polish person out there, or and understanding that not everybody automatically was anti-Semitic, and there were lots of good people too.
Right.
And that was her life. And so that story about the gentleman who was standing over a pit with a gun to his head, three times over a pit of bodies. Those people were our close friends. They were my grandparents' close friends. She was the one who convinced him to tell his story. So now I have all these recordings of her and him, which I haven't been able to listen to, but she managed to get that story published in a Polish volume, basically. And so and that's what she was doing. She was doing the same thing. She was just getting those stories out there so they wouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah. That's really, really interesting. And you had a chance to, you were in Warsaw this past year and went to the archives, and just say a little bit about the archivist's approach to things.
Oh, yeah, Anna, she's amazing. I actually have since met other people who, when I say Anna, they're like, "Oh, yeah, she's amazing."
And at
Um,
the
she runs that place. So Anna's the main archivist at the Jewish Historical Institute, and I did make an appointment to see her because I just wanted to know. I've been wanting to know what happened to my great grandparents on both my from both on my maternal side.
right,
Um, and I know they all perished during the war, but their names aren't in any of the camps around Lvov, and I haven't found anything in the Lvov archives either. And I actually hired a genealogist a few years ago, and they haven't really been able to find anything either. So my feeling is not to have them erased
right.
completely.
Yeah.
And so I went to see her, and it was really interesting because the minute I said that, she just looked at me, and I love her for this. It sounds harsh when I say it, but I actually appreciate what she said. And she said, "No, you will never know what happened to them. I can't
Wow.
help you with that because all we have are stories, and people make things up. People don't remember things clearly. People soften things. People forget details, right? That's what happens."
Yeah.
So
Mm.
she said, "No, you're never going to know. Even if we find records, that doesn't mean that the records were real."
That's so interesting. And this is the archivist. Yeah. I mean, this is the tough love version. Like this.
Yeah. So horrible, but I appreciate it. But this way, now I still want to find out if I can find something about their lives or find their names somewhere. I know what streets they lived on. I have addresses. My grandfather kept all that.
Fantastic.
So I'm still hoping to find something about them, but I guess I'll just have to, I don't know, be okay knowing that they perished somehow.
Right. And that you're doing all you can do to honor that, the memory of them in some way. And was she able to help you with any specifics to like pointers to what you could do, or
Yeah,
what is
the one thing I still need to do, and I haven't done it because dealing with Polish, red tape can just it's just exhausting, is I need to contact, and see if I can find if they have some record of my grandmother's, birth in because that would have been transferred to Warsaw, and there should be some record of my grandmother, maternal grandmother, and then I also possibly of her brother.
okay.
'Cause he also perished, but again, she never talked about him, you know, I have Natek, which is, first name, and that's it, and I know nothing else about him.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
all it says in this interview that was translated, he perished in the Far East. I don't even know
And
what that means.
and to keep in mind, your grandmother lived with you. It's not like she was at a distance and you were,
Yeah,
you had to communicate with her in Poland. She lived with you, and this was still how what she felt, this very the guarding, that silence.
mhm,
Did you know she'd had a brother?
not growing up.
Not growing up at all.
No,
Yeah.
no, I don't maybe somewhere somebody mentioned it, but not we knew my grandfather's side of the family. The his sister that survived because she moved to Germany after the war, they were doing they were giving out reparations and she moved there, and so we grew up knowing some of that side of the family, but on my grandmother's side, not really. There was a cousin of hers, a much younger cousin. This lady is still alive, and I actually have my grandmother's testimony that she gave to the Jewish Historical Institute.
Uh,
This cousin was, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and when the Nazis invaded, someone she was, like, 5, someone threw the child under the table. The tablecloth happened to cover the go down to the floor.
yeah.
The child happened to not make a sound. Nobody happened to look under the table. You know, it was one of those
Yeah.
just luck,
Yeah.
and she was taken in and she survived, with at a local convent. And then but then after the war, I think they may have she may be Catholic, like, she may have sort of kept that, but I do have an official statement that my grandmother had to give, and in the '80s, not this
Right.
was years after the war,
Yeah.
saying who she was and what her name was before the war and all of that, so,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And those were the choices that families had to make, right? I mean,
Yeah,
people had to do what they had to do to survive. Like the Alison Pick's book, Between Gods, is so interesting because she learned that she was Jewish on the playground,
yeah,
literally in the town where I live in Waterloo, where she grew up. And it was because other kids were like, "Oh yeah, Pick, that's a Jewish name." She's like,
yeah,
"Oh, she grew up Christian." No, because of course, then she discovers that there was that whole side of her family, and the way they protected themselves was to assimilate and just, I mean, and it's just so telling. It's just so telling. Like these are the human responses to, unbelievable trauma. And I think it behooves us to remember these things, right? It's not people have to make decisions about what they're going to do to survive. And then it's not really for us to sit in judgment of that, but to honor and discover and try to understand all the different ways and then bring the stories forward in a much deeper way.
yeah, absolutely, and especially I think the women too, because they would have just had it harder because they were women, and my grandmother, for example, um, she was there and my grandfather got work when they got to Uzbekistan, but she didn't. She had to suddenly survive. She hadn't made it. Her dream was to be a doctor. Because of numerous clauses, she didn't because they only accepted a certain amount of women, a certain amount of Jews. She didn't make it in the
Right.
cut prior to the war starting in the 30s, and so then she had to sort of just make her way in the world, basically. She actually, lost 1 or 2 babies during the war, boys, that again, nobody talked about this, nobody honored this, nobody I don't know where they would have been born, I don't know anything about that. She then decided when they got to Moscow finally, she decided that she was just gonna go, and she showed up, walked into a, um m university, started attending classes, and, I guess they didn't have what the MCATs or anything like that at the time, and they
If
just
she was sitting in class, she was there
yeah,
to
they accepted her, and,
yeah,
so she had that struggle, and then for her, uh, this part too, again, they were in Russia, and so we only found out after my mother died that my there's a chance that my mother's birthday wasn't really when her birthday was, because she was probably born in Soviet territory, and then her, birth certificate was lost, right? And a new one was made that my mother was actually born in Poland, because they didn't want anything to do with,
yeah,
Soviet anything, Russia anything, German anything.
yeah,
So it was all just trying to protect the family, protect everybody, and then, the whole story of their last names were changed too, right? Because their
yeah,
last names were too Jewish, German, too Jewish, German sounding.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, the history was just they erased their own history too.
Exactly, right? To survive. They
Yeah.
erase their own history, and then it falls to the next generation. There's always somebody. I'm so fascinated by this because I just do this work with people, help them recover their histories that are lost or suppressed in a family, and that just seems to always come my way. Wander into my line of sight. Uh, and it often invariably there's someone in a family in a generation who will say it falls to them, like they're the ones who feel like you do. They feel like I need to do something here. What is it that I need to do? And other people in the same family don't necessarily feel that, or they don't want to be the ones to, they don't feel it, they're not oriented that way. Sometimes they're disturbed by material that's uncovered. They don't want to know that either. Or they are supportive of the person who's doing it, but they're not that frontline person, right? You're that frontline person. I'm that front.
I think that happened for me. I always liked stories. That was always a thing. I loved to sit with my parents, listen to the stories they would tell. My dad was part of the theater, and so we had a lot of when we moved to Canada, we had a lot of people from the theater coming to visit when they had their different events here. So I always loved that. That was never a question. And I think for me, the deep dive started right after my mother died when I was 19. And I
Yeah.
was like, I suddenly realized there was so little I knew about her family and really about that history, um, of what had happened to my family. And
Mm.
so my dad did his best to fill the holes, but it that the summer she died in 1995 in March. That summer, my dad said that he was wanted my sister and me to see where our roots were, and he took us to Poland. And that's when we first went to Auschwitz. We did the tour there. It was before, like now you need to have a tour guide with you. It's a whole thing. This
Mhm.
was well before that. So there were very few people. It was much rougher than it is now. And,
Yeah.
we took the road around that. And basically, we just seeing that. And then for us, it was the worst when we entered just down the street from Auschwitz, the death camp, because Auschwitz was a concentration camp. And we
Yeah.
walked in and at the time there was nothing. There are barracks and things, but
Yeah.
there was nothing. There was just um, a gate and
Mhm.
tracks that ended.
Yeah.
And we walked through that gate and we got to where the tracks ended, and all of us lost it. And we just stood there, and it was kind of the seepy rain. I don't know, anytime I've been to Auschwitz several times now. Every time I go, it's like a seepy, rainy day, so I'm convinced that that's what it is.
Yeah.
And we got there, and all of us just went, "No." And we turned around, and we all walked out, and it was then that I thought, "Oh, no, I need to stay on these stories. I need
And
to."
you would have been how old
I
at the
was
time?
19.
19. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And your dad, it needs to be said, was not Jewish,
No,
right? I mean, but your dad had
he was my
that
mother's biggest fan.
yeah. And you
She
have
was the love of
that
his life.
storytelling side. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what it takes, right? I think this is what allyship looks like. Your father was one of those. I hope in my best moments to be an ally in that way, where all you can do is do everything in your power to try to support people. Um, yeah, it's just really, really important work. I think we said you're really good at checking chat. I don't. And we've gone twice as long as we
I know.
as we said we would. But I know like I want to be able to just hold these spontaneous Substack lives to be able to talk about these things, like just to do a deep dive in a short period of time and talk about a sacred trust of storytelling. It's just so powerful. It's so important. And it's complicated, right? As hats off to Anna the archivist. Like, let's be realistic about what we can do and what we know and how we live our lives in relation to what we discover and what we unpack.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thanks
Thank
for being
you.
here. We'll do everything in our power to make sure all these things are remembered and
These
held.
stories, yeah, and the stories can't be forgotten, right?
It cannot be forgotten. Thanks everybody for being here. Talk to you later. Bye for now. Aw, are we still on? How do I
Yes.
do?